Hello and welcome to the Australian and New Zealand Environmental History Network Conference for 2020. I'm Dr. Margaret Cook from the University of the Sunshine Coast. I'm speaking to you from the lands of the Yagara people in Ipswich, Queensland, and I acknowledge their elders, past, present and emerging, as well as those of the lands from where you are joining us. And now I'd like to welcome our speaker, Wendy Beck. Thanks, Wendy.
And I'd like to thank my co-authors for this paper, who are Robin Bartell, Robert Hayworth and John Appleton, also from the University of New England. And I should start perhaps by saying I'm an archaeologist, so some of what I'm going to talk about will be about deep time. But first of all, I want to talk about cultural landscapes and how we understand them. First of all, a cultural landscape is fashioned from a natural landscape by a culture group, and this is a quote from Carl Sawyer. Culture is the agent, the natural area is the medium, the cultural landscape is the result. And that's from a book he wrote called The Morphology of Landscapes. So landscapes are never simply a natural space, they're a feature of the natural environment, but every landscape is the place where we establish our own human organisation of space and time, which is a quote from John Jackson. So landscapes are very complex phenomena. In addition to the assemblage of physical features on which geographers and others focused until the last 30 years or so, it's now widely accepted that landscapes reflect human activity and are imbued with cultural values. So they combine elements of space and time, and they represent political as well as social and cultural constructs. So what I'm going to be talking about today are the upland wetlands from the New England bioregion, which is that darker green area in the middle, and you can see Armidale is where I'm located, which is to the south of that area. This is a rather old map, but the reason I've included it is it shows you the highway going from north to south, from Armidale up to the border with Queensland, and the brown areas, the darker areas, are the upland areas. So they are areas roughly above 600 metres, and you can see that they go along the spine there of the New England bioregion. Now, here's a typical example of an upland wetland from the air. This particular lagoon is Dangar's Lagoon. And you can on the right-hand side and on the left-hand side of Thunderbolt's Way is Racecourse Lagoon. Now, the earliest Aboriginal water practices, of course, centred around the adaptation to temporary lagoons. These are all temporary water bodies. So what I'm interested in asking, I guess, is how has the power of the past predetermined water practices in these upland lagoons in both Aboriginal and in white settlers' times? And to answer this question, we need to examine the cultural landscapes. And I think the answer lies in the idea that climate and its changes over time have fundamentally determined the parameters within which cultural landscapes can be formed. So first of all, if we look at Aboriginal practices, this is just a geographical map of the 60 or so upland lagoons. And you can see again, they cluster around the spine of the higher areas of the tablelands in New England, the New England bioregion. This is a photograph of Dangar's Lagoon with a lot of water in it. This is a 1988 photograph, which was taken by Bob Hayworth. And you can see that the water there is always probably never more than a metre in depth. This is typical of upland lagoons in the New England, but it does, of course, form a habitat for birds, as well as this is what it looks like when there's no water. This is a photograph by myself. So you can see there's quite a difference in full of water and not full of water. So the changes over time are very significant in the cultural landscape here. So this is dates that we obtained for the formation of various lagoons. Dangar's Lagoon is the DG number there. So we have the depth here below the surface and the mean date in tens of thousands of years. So if we look at DG LO2, for example, it's at a depth of about 80 centimetres or 70 centimetres below the surface, and the date there is around about 15,000 at that particular point. if we go deeper in our excavations down to a metre or so, we see that we go back, in fact, to nearly 50,000 years ago. So interestingly enough, there's probably only been permanent water in that lagoon maybe twice in the last 48,000 years. So there's been 48,000 years of lake fluctuations, and not always perhaps as you might expect it to be during a wetter climate, interestingly enough. So we're not really sure about what causes this, but basically this is a summary of the kind of episodic filling and drying that you can see. So between 48,000 and the last ice age, you have intermittently full and empty with not really a clear cycle. Then after the last, or during and after the glacial maximum, when it was very cold in Australia, you have longer duration cycles. And then in this period between this is when the time of when there is a warming period after the glacial maximum, when things were very cold in the ice age. And then we find at Dangar's lagoon, in these lagoons, there's nearly a permanent phase between 6,000 and 1,000, and then a more intermittent phase in the last 1,000 years. So you can see that there is quite a big change between the full and the kind of phasing of wet and dry phases. So in terms of what Aboriginal people were doing during these periods of time, we assume that there was birding going on. There are a lot of water birds attracted at various times, mostly actually when the lagoons are half full rather than when they're full or dry, as well as economic water plants as well. So we just have, of course, the typical boomerang, which was used for hunting water birds, as well as this kind of netting, which was probably used as well during the Aboriginal phase of occupation. This is a scarred tree at Little Langothlin Lagoon, which again suggests that there were other kinds of activities going on nearby the lagoons, not just hunting and fishing. Of course, there are no fish as such in these lagoons because they're too temporary, but there are eels for certain, and there are certainly yabbies and things like that. So here is another photograph of Little Langothlin. Little Langothlin is in this particular photo is quite full. You can see there's a scarred tree in the foreground. And this is Little Langothlin, which is a Ramsar wetland, which I think the previous speaker referred to, and it's probably got the least disturbed surroundings of any other lagoons, which is why the scarred trees have survived. But obviously, as these lagoons have changed over time and as human activity has changed, they've acquired many layers of meaning that can be analysed through historical, archaeological, geographical and sociological study. So landscapes can be understood as texts in a way susceptible to analysis by means similar to those in which literary and other texts are analysed. So we know that these lagoons, for example, have been represented in poetry, in painting and in film. But understanding the cultural landscape of Australia is an integral part of the process of examining and celebrating Australia's cultural diversity. So if we move on now to, that's just a map showing you the scarred trees and other archaeological sites associated with Little Langothlin, the Ramsar wetland. Now, of course, the post-colonial landscapes have been created by a diverse range of cultural groups operating within a political, legal and planning system which was derived from England. But the international recognition that landscapes have cultural value and intangible attributes has been significantly influenced by Australian research on Indigenous Australian connections to land and the associated concept of country. So places of contemporary social significance are part and parcel of how Indigenous people construct their social identities today, and are also intimately linked to longer-term patterns of maintaining social identity. But overlaid on this, however, are the repercussions brought about by contact with European settlers who place very different cultural values on the same physical landscape. So if we move on to, so here are some Aboriginal people during our research project, and we have an elder instructing a couple of the young people who worked with us on this project. And now here we have a special, well, an unusual site near Llangollen Lake, which is to the north of the Ramsar wetland. It's in private property, and it's Baggott's Mill. So I'll come back to that in a moment. But first of all, just to talk about some of the heritage management criteria that we might associate with lagoons. Okay. So basically, this is a cultural landscape. The upland wetland group, perhaps only 2% of Australia is at over 1,000 metres, where most of these lagoons occur. And they have alongside them on their eastern sides lunettes, which are sand dunes, which are luckily able to be dated and therefore leave some sort of record of Aboriginal occupation. So because they have a limited area, they are in fact a nationally significant landscape. They have a multifaceted nature and they have cultural continuity, both in terms of being used by successive inhabitants for different purposes, which were shared by both Aboriginal and European inhabitants. So there's a sequential use of these wetlands for food by Aboriginal people and by white people, as water for farmers, water by stockmen, and water for recreation. So just to go quickly through the rest of the slides, this is a 1943 photograph of Llangollen Lake. And here are some people boating. This is actually on Mother of Ducks Lagoon. This is in the 1880s. And here's another picture from the Mother of Ducks in the 1880s. So this, of course, is a large, now dammed lagoon. It has a golf course on it at the moment near Guyra. So it's south of Llangollen. And here we have Dangar's Lagoon, the first slide I showed you, with a picnic in 1911. So there's an overlapping phase of occupation by white people and by Aboriginal people. This is a wonderful photograph during the construction of the dam at Mother of Ducks in 1951. This is an Aboriginal family, the Taylors, who are perched on the newly constructed dam. There's Mr. Taylor and there's, I'm sorry, that's not the Taylors, it's the Walkers. This is Mrs. Walker with her son at Mother of Ducks Lagoon in 1951. So Mother of Ducks is now pretty much obliterated. There are some water birds there still, but it's been filled in mostly for a golf course. So basically we have to talk about, and I'm interested in the management of these lagoons, how we might manage them into the future. You can see this one is fairly typical. It has a travelling stock reserve over part of it. This is one of the northernmost lagoons in the Tablelands. And you can see that fence line which goes right through the middle of it. So the southern is public land, the northern part is private property. But basically we want to be able to manage these lagoons as cultural landscapes because they have the promotion of their significance as cultural as well as natural. So we have to we have to be able to assess both of the aspects of this significance. So we see landscapes through our existing mindsets which are influenced in part by what we already know or expect, but in part by the things which interest us most. And I think these mindsets are fairly obvious in some of the tourism aspects of these lagoons, which I don't have time to go into now. But just to reiterate that these are cultural and historical landscapes which show both a resistance through time to change as well as renewal over time. So I'd like to acknowledge the assistance of the 4 land councils listed there as well as the ARC grant granted in 2012. Thank you.